So we've got a great panel. Our first panelist, who I will shortly introduce you to, is going to have to leave directly after he has spoken. Each of our speakers will speak for approximately sort of 10 minutes or so. But our first speaker is Associate Professor Graeme Smith, who is well known to many of you. Graeme is a Senior Fellow with DPA. And he's going to be talking about what has changed about China's engagement with the region over the 3 years since the last State of the Pacific conference. And because he's got to go to teach shortly afterwards, we'll have a couple of questions after he's finished. Graeme.
So what's changed? First I should acknowledge the team, without which I would be nothing, because I have two small children, so I can't really do a lot of field work these days. So particular mention to my PhD students, Pete Connolly and Sean Gessler, and the rest of the newly graduated, or not so newly graduated team, Denghua Zhang, Yichang Guo, Ash Noah over in New Zealand, and Mika Barreto Suarez, the freshly minted Swinburne graduate. So what's happened in the last 4 years with China's engagement with the region? Gosh, not much. So there's a lot more companies. We track the movement of companies into the region. There's a lot more state-owned enterprises set up in the Pacific. But paradoxically, largely because of COVID, there is a lot less investment. And what was labelled an unprecedented visit by the Chinese Foreign Minister to 8 Pacific nations actually wasn't unprecedented. His predecessor in 2006 also visited 8 nations, and those were all the 8 nations that recognised China at the time, including Niue. So not unprecedented, but Wang Yi's visit can perhaps be thought of not just as an ambitious play with the regional agreement that didn't get up, but also in terms of, on the Chinese side, encouraging Chinese businesses to invest in the Pacific. Just as America struggles to get US companies to come to the Pacific, the PRC is now experiencing a similar thing, not helped by the economic headwinds that they're facing in China. For the first time in my living memory, China is now growing at a slower rate than the rest of Asia. And this is a very different China. So if we're thinking about security considerations, a low growth nationalistic China might be more of a concern than a high growth pragmatic China, which is what we've been used to dealing with. Upticks that we've seen, the representatives of China in the Pacific have really improved in terms of the quality and in terms of their Pacific expertise. It's really notable that 10 years ago, it's kind of where they were sending their no-hopers. Now you're getting guys like Li Ming, who have a real background in the region, have been working on the Pacific for 2 decades. So that has been a real interesting change. The other uptick has been companies dabbling in geopolitics for commercial gain. China Sam and Zhenghong Fisheries come to mind, and this has caused a bit of heartburn on the other side of the lake. And often we jump at shadows and don't jump at the things we should jump at, would be the generalisation. China Sam should have given us cause for concern. Zhenghong Fisheries, not so much. There was a few guys setting up an operation in Port Moresby with very little behind them. But it benefited them because the Chinese state then took them seriously, which they hadn't been up to the point where Australia jumped up and down. Plenty of other companies wish this whole geopolitics things would go away because it's not good for their business. They won't say that in public, of course. The other big change, and it's worth dropping in a mention because this is what keeps me busy media-wise, is Mr. Sogavare. He presents an opportunity to China, and Solomons presents an opportunity. You always have greater intensity when you've in the first flush of recognition. That's quite normal. But it appears that Solomons is a conduit in a way that Beijing had been hoping for, but had not yet found in the Pacific. So that's interesting to watch. The unknowns to watch would be what's going to happen with China's economy. We really don't know. If you look at the real estate figures in China, it really is looking like a Ponzi scheme on the way down. So we're looking at a Japan type scenario, so Japan in 1990. How that will play out is really not anything to be confident about. As a Brazilian friend said to me, whenever the economy goes bad, that's when we play the nationalism card in Latin America. And I think a similar thing might happen in China. The other unknown is creeping extraterritoriality. this effort by the Chinese state to police its citizens abroad. And the policing agreement, again, understandably our focus is on what it means for Solomon Islands, but it also has big implications for the Chinese diaspora in that country. And this effort to govern in an extraterritorial sense, we've seen examples in Fiji in 2017, in Vanuatu in 2019. The sort of friction this could lead to is really worth keeping an eye upon. And a lot of it happens under the radar. These are the things we know about. There are people that act as gatekeepers for the Chinese state, and often people are repatriated on some pretty sketchy grounds. So I'll leave it there and open to questions.
Okay, we're going to finish Graeme's presentation now. So a big hand for Graeme. Thanks very much. So our next speaker is Dr. Henry Ivarature, who is a Pacific Fellow and also Interim Director with the Australian Pacific Security College. Now Henry, as I believe it, is going to be discussing some of the issues raised by the, I think it's 5 national security strategies that have been prepared since 2018 under the auspices of the Boe Declaration. So Henry, over to you.
That's me. The reason why I'm talking about national security strategies in the Pacific is because the Australian Pacific Security College, one of its annual program outcomes is to support national security strategies and their development. Is to support the FICs with the national security strategies. Now the reason why I'm going there is we need to go back to the basics and the authority in which national security strategies are derived from. And they come from the Boe Declaration. And those are some of the principles of the Boe Declaration, which I'm sure you are all very familiar with. So I don't need to go into those details, but that's the authority under which national security strategies are derived from. And as a college, we have to go back to the basics and see what the basics says as to guide us going forward in our support to the region. Now, up there you see the specific area where national security strategies are derived from is from the Boe Declaration Action Plan, which leaders endorsed in 2019 in Tuvalu. And in there are the specific area where you see national security strategies coming from is this area called Environment for Implementation and Coordination, and you find national security strategies situated in there. And basically, that's what it says about strategy development, policies, capability, capacity, so that they can be implemented and strengthen national security at the national level. That's the definition that Boe Declaration writes about national security. It's an adaptable framework. It's a framework that can be adopted over time. Those flags there, those are the countries that have developed national security strategies. As Papua New Guinea developed its in 2013, well before Boe, but most of its articulation of security issues are consistent with the Boe Declaration. It just needs to be refreshed and updated. And fortunately, I had the opportunity to meet with the Secretary for Prime Minister NNC after this morning's session and encouraged him to consider the support that the college can provide. Now, in saying that, the college is very mindful of things like sovereignty of these countries to deal with very sensitive matters like national security strategies. Palau is the most recent one, was endorsed, released in June this year. So we have those countries. If you see your country's flags there, you should be proud, because one of the measurements for this particular proposed action is the number of countries that develop national security strategies. And there are roughly 14 foreign island governments, but 18 members. So we hope through our college can be able to facilitate, and we are doing those negotiations, but we have to work with the Pacific Islands Forum Secretariat. And I'm glad to say that we have structured our ways of working with the Forum Secretariat, and then we'll be pursuing this work forward in close consultation with the Forum Secretariat. Because the Forum is really the custodian of all these BOE declarations. And to work with in developing and implementing this, you have to work with a forum sectarian. So the others are Samoa, Vanuatu, Solomon Islands, and Palau, of course. Yeah. Now, if you look at the national security strategies, it's mainly around human security. I don't want to, you already know what the expanded concept of security is, so I won't go into those, but most of the national security strategies cover issues around human security, and mainly developmental in nature. That's what you see in there. And we've got to recognize that this process is arrived at through a national consultation process involving all stakeholders. And this is what they have come up with. We've got to respect that, and we've got to support them in implementing this strategy. So that's just a quick overview of the key security priorities. You can see most of it is in human and environmental security. Now, the implementation challenges that we see, or I see from this, is actually operationalizing the strategy. It's very easy to create a strategy. It's another question to put the strategy into operation. So the countries need support to operationalize it. There's challenges with security sector agency coordination that needs to be strengthened. Integrating key stakeholders in the whole process. Promoting security as a national discourse in support of socio-economic development. Navigating internal politics. So you have, many countries have all kinds of national policies, etc. And when a national security strategy comes into place, the people who run it and manage it must navigate the internal politics with other government departments and other priorities that they are running. So you can't expect them to be national security strategies to have priority. Yeah? They've got to compete with resources. And many FICs, as you all know, don't have the resources and the capacity to deliver these things. Yeah? This is also the culture of all common silos. So we all work in silos. It's the same problem with national security strategy. Security sector agencies work in silos. So they need to break down the silos to get a comprehensive whole of government approach to getting this across there, and building intelligence capacity and capability. Proud to say here today that we are helping Palau build its intelligence capacity, and that's the TOI is underway, and we are working towards getting that going. As well as information sharing. But one thing that I want to stress here is sustained allocation of resource over the long term. It has to go over the long term. And people in these roles must fight to ensure that they have resources coming in and that resources help them going forward to implement it. Now, I just put this up here because of, and I call it important considerations. And national sovereignty is one that we have to really work sensitively and respectfully with FICs, because national security is a sovereign matter. And my experience of dealing with Papua New Guinea, my own country, has shown that I've got to respect my country's sensitivity to national security as a sovereign matter. So there's ways in which we've got to work, build that relationship, and get it going. But it will be supported if there's very strong relationship. So in the islands, relationships matter. In this part of the world, we have to also cultivate and build a relationship so there's trust, that I'm not going to come and spy or build a capacity that I will spy. I have actually been in those situations as well. And so I've got to build trust with my Papua New Guinean colleagues in the support that I'm going to provide to national security strategy strengthening in PNG. Now, leadership. We all talk about leadership at the political level, but in this experience in delivering national security strategies, what I find is that when the political leadership comes into play, it has to be backed by a foundation of very competent, very strong, and very capable bureaucrats, because they're the ones that lift this game of strengthening the national capacity around national security and coordinating across the board, across the government. So that's a key point to remember. Finally, I'm going to talk about, that's the Pacific Vision 2050. I have a lot of questions. And while, so these are the questions that are up there. It states in the Boyd in Vision 2050 that it builds on the Boyd Declaration and the Boyd Action Plan. But there are so many questions, and one of the questions I'm asking in there is, does the 2050 strategy relegate Boyd Declaration and the Action Plan? Does it relegate it? That's a question I need answers to. Or does it refine and elaborate on Boyd? Because the expanded security is referred in a peace and security thematic area. Or does Boyd, and does Boyd operate under this? The picture is not quite clear. There's no reference to national security strategies. And so, do Boyd and the Action Plan operate in conjunction or in parallel to the 2050 strategy? And will national security strategies be covered in the 2050 implementation plan, which is yet to be developed, and the M&E framework? And when I think about all of this, and when I was reading John Wallis and Co., their work, made me wonder, is it a patchwork of arrangements devoid of the coherence that the 2050 strategy is supposed to herald? So, those are the questions, and that's my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Henry, and some insight there into, amongst other things, the work of the Australia Pacific Security College, which is largely, I think, sort of focused on trying to implement the national security strategies. We're going to move from that, and I also believe that Henry has a written paper for anyone who has sort of interest on these issues that he is prepared to share with you. We're now going to move on to Salā, Dr. George Carter, who is also here at the ANU. He's a research fellow at DPA. He's also director of the ANU's Pacific Institute. And George's research, which I'm sure many of you will be familiar with, explores the international politics of climate change, geopolitics and regionalism, as well as the foreign policy and diplomacies of small island states. Today, George is going to discuss how small states from the Pacific region are securitizing climate change and elevating the climate security nexus that Anna just referred to. And he's also, I think, going to talk about a current project that he's involved in, an action research project, which explores how Pacific states and regional organisations are defining, designing and implementing an agenda on climate change in the Pacific. George.
Thank you. Mono fatalo fatalo fatu even malu tato tunu faina fa fonga mai olo nei pa pe foi fa fonga mai ngole zu fatalo fa pito atu le tai o tato tanga wenga lawa fionga Dr. Mema Mutsanga fa pe foi lawa fionga the to five le dean of the Faculty of Arts National University of Samoa of Sawia fa pe foi fa malu tato officer o le ofisa Lambasa mawalunga nei I Canberra fatalofa lange mau so for mau. First I'd like to acknowledge the indigenous owners and of the land where we stand, Ngunnawal and Ngambri people, past and present. This presentation here is part of a collection of papers, but also an ongoing project that started in 2019 when I was at the Pacific Island Forum in Funafuti, trying to figure which one. While I was following climate change politics in terms of finance, it seemed security tended to be a topic that was getting louder and louder. Then I spent a few 3 months within the University of South Pacific, and I acknowledge our research partners there. They were able to take me not only to the villages, but also take me inside regional forums, and what was happening in these discussions, again, was getting louder and louder. And then I spent a great 9 months in Samoa with the National University of Samoa, as well as the Secretariat Regional Environmental Program. And many things were happening. Yeah? And this is what happens to those of us in IR who look at trends, but also I use ethnography a lot in my research, that things are coming together, pieces are coming aligned, and part of this was this idea around securitization, or securitizing climate change in the Pacific. So what I'll present on is the work that's carried on the last 2 years, and the potential of where this could lead to. That while we think about conceptualizing climate change or climate security in the Pacific, what was happening at multi-levels, it's going all at the same time with implementation because of the urgency in action. In academia, we tend to like to sit down and think about how do we conceptualize. We go into the Pacific when we're looking at policy. How do policymakers conceptualize? How do we carry out this? But what I found from listening and participating in multiple sites over the last 2 years, even up to last week, is that implementation is going at a speed none like it. And it's important for us researchers and policymakers to take it into account that this is the Pacific way of implementing climate security. So the literature tends to look at 3 or 4 different ways of looking at climate security. The role of the nation state, its concerns over sovereignty, its concern over warfare, defense, and its capability. Of course, we are also familiar in how the literature deals with it being a climate change, being a mitigation, and the practices around how to minimize the threat itself, or how countries, the states adapt to climate change. However, I'd like to sort of broaden this by taking it further, securitization, not just looking at the narratives and the discourses around it. I found that when I was trying to play around with these ideas, it's actually moving at a speed in the Pacific that's more about implementation, and everything was happening at the same time. So what I'm particularly from an IR thread is how states in multiple levels implement climate security. Very easy question. Important, Pacific is leading this across the world, while other countries are slowly conceptualizing, thinking about these roles in the Pacific, especially particular countries. And what I'll end up with from the conclusion is there's a particular core group that's pushing and implementing this as we go along. And while climate security is undefined, there's no consensus on the processes, there's an urgent implementation happening. And so the way I structure or try to think about this project is that it's aimed at looking and exploring how states address climate impacts on their security interests and security systems through 5 different themes or levels. At the international security, basically looking at UN Security Council and the UNFCCC. Secondary level is looking at the regional security, how regional organizations, and then of course national security and how national governments and their security councils and community climate change, community of practice are thinking about or implementing some of these roles. And the area where I lack, but where I see so great innovation, hearing the last seminar, but also what's already been happening for quite the last 30 years, is the role of community security, individual security, which I hope to propose to elevate this in this view of a framework of addressing climate security. Most of you know, well, who are familiar with my research, is that I use what I call as global talanoa. So it's a multi-level, multi-sided political ethnography. I go into these meetings, participate, observe, and work with leaders. I work with CEOs, work with practitioners, as well as NGOs who are at these multiple levels of conversations, creating dialogue, to try and tease out not only their lessons, their aspirations, but hopefully solutions in which they're defining. And we work with them as we move along in these work. So part of that is process and practice tracing thinking and talking over them. What are you doing? Why are you doing this? What else do you need? And through utilizing Talanoa. So I use that a lot with my UNFCCC negotiations. This time round, I've incorporated action research by working now in partnerships with universities like National University of Samoa, University of South Pacific. Action research by having a linkage with SPRIP as their research guide in pushing through and providing research papers as we move along, or working within expert groups such as the Climate Security Network through the Pacific Island Forum. It's providing that research advice, and where I'm trying to say and elevate the type of work, another type of work or strand in thinking about our research is research brokerage in policy. But not waiting and for things to happen, but being part and parcel as these decisions are being made and how countries and also organizations are trying to implement this. So being part of the process as we move along. And so at the international impetus, we of course know about the role of UN Security Council in elevating this through the Security Council in 2007, 2011 and 14, where Pacific Island states were fundamental, especially Papua New Guinea, in pushing forth this issue of having climate change discussed within the forum. While it may not successful in terms of having further action, what came out of it was the UN Security General Secretary statement in 2009, which actually elevated climate change into the work of the UN. And so from there, they've developed 5 key areas of their work. And part of that, you're starting to see it now. UNDP has a UN security, climate security project in Fiji that looks at the 3 coral atoll nations. That is an impact of Pacific countries at the UNSC, creating a UNSG statement that creates an agenda within the UN that flows through the current project that's now happening. That project is important because that's feeding the UN regional PIF currently at the moment, as we discuss 2 main frameworks on climate migration and the other framework that currently discuss on the climate security. Here's that other link where what this research is trying to provide is, it's not just things happening out there. Pacific countries are impacting this through that international level. Of course, the other side is through the International Panel of Climate Change, where we do have a number, but there is a necessity for more research and researchers from the Pacific to have an input in these climate forum, in this political research forum of the IPCC. There's a small number, but there needs to be more researchers. And of course, where the core of my research on the UNFCCC, I can talk about that in another discussion, and how working through the one crop in the Pacific sits. Henry spoke about the big political impetus at the moment within not only the 2050 strategy of the Blue Continent, through the 2 pillars of peace and security, as well as the climate change in ocean, but as well as we know, in the last few years, I'm working my way upwards, through the climate crisis and emergency. These were elevated not only in 2019 at Kainaki, but as well recently at the 2022 Suva Pacific Island Forum. But we also are seeing this trend in countries elevating this as a national climate emergency, like Fiji and Nauru. What's important here that has come through some of the discussions is the use of emergency in this. While it creates that urgency, there was that questions around the powers. What happens to the powers of the states when this is evoked? Something that came through a lot from discussions like this. But of course, the existing work on the framework for resilient development, which is the existing sort of community out there that have been evaluating and looking around areas of climate resilience and adaptation mitigation, as well as through finance. Security, traditional security cooperation has come through in the last 2-3 years. Of course, we've seen this being discussed within the South Pacific Defense Ministers meeting, as well as the Joint Heads of Security. Now, it's not been in-depth in terms of while it's been discussed within these forums, they haven't really identified one of the key challenges that these forums have come through is in the area of roles. In dealing with the expansion of the roles of traditional security, including immigration, customs, police, and military, and what their role is in terms of climate adaptation, and well as in the area of mitigation. Now, in continuing this research, continue to work with SPREP as they develop their climate work stream, but as well with the Pacific Island Forum and UNDP through what is the Pacific Climate Security Expert Network. And as I've said, part of this group, these discussions revolve around these discussions of creating framework around migration, but as well as climate security. At the national level, there is an impetus. Before I talk about National Security Council, NSCs, I'll talk about NDCs. These are already elevated within the statements by countries which have been delivered through the UNFCCC or UNF Framework Convention on Climate Change. What these texts say, as countries like Marshall Islands, Nauru, Tuvalu says, there's a clear link of climate change to their political stability, especially in the area of coastal erosion. Kiribati is saying that sea level rise increases conflict and stress due to loss of property of land. Nauru, Tonga, and Solomon Islands have clearly stated that climate change threatens the very existence of people on the nation. And important that Tuvalu also have stated, as well as Niue, the importance of culture. What these statements are saying here is that these are where the threads of how climate change impacts. The issue that we have at the moment in many of these discussions is not enough research, or there's no reports that support these statements. These are made from what has been discussed in national stakeholders, but clearly there's a gap here for research to feed that. And of course, as Henry mentioned, with the national security policies, while I have not had a look at Palau, in all the other three countries, Vanuatu, Papua New Guinea, Samoa, climate change is clearly within the National Security Council, national security policy, and is a priority. Now, the sites of exploration here is the work that we've been conducting with the Samoa Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade. In 2009, through the work stream of SPREP, we've explored in terms of how to bring these national stakeholders through the National Security Council and the climate change. And while it's been a successful first informal meeting, there clearly was an acknowledgement that a lot of discussion needs to happen around the roles and responsibilities of these national agencies before they come together. But as this project continues, it's sort of expanding this. They've highlighted a list of 5 key areas which they'd like to explore before a national forum comes through. So what we have here, although there hasn't been a consensus or an agreement on what this climate security issue is, there clearly is they want to implement something. And that's something that's comes through from after this site. So I'll finish here in terms of putting forth what I see as key themes as this project continues. Climate security is a high politics for the Pacific in terms of not only its regional work but international advocacy. However, climate security is still undefined. Socialization of this issue is happening at all levels at multiple speeds. And it's important for us who are working in this space to take into account not only the actors, but also these spaces in which they're discussed. There's a myriad of actors and vested interest. Of course, you have the donors coming through who will want to participate in this space. But this is an area where you have officials say, you do not enter this space until we allowed you to come through. And that's very important, especially in this area of security. And of course, how national governments, in case here of Samoa, give the space for the security sector as well as climate change community practice to find that synergy in which to continue. The process and politics of power relations in these areas happy to explore more in the questions, but there still is a limited research informing this implementation. And in terms of core group, it's fundamental that this was shown within UNFCCC research, as well as we find here now in climate security, that there's a core group of individuals within the Pacific, from researchers to academia, to policymakers, to leaders, who know the climate speak and the security speak, who are in this area, who not only control but also can inform the process. And so the last two slides you mentioned in terms of implications and where does this read, we see it here in this space, the need to revisit it, especially around the issues around relationships and brokerage. The space of innovation, I find, is where community security, individual security, is not necessarily informing the work that's carrying out at the community national level. One of the things that we're finding through, especially working in national university, is linking national universities into the community, into the policy space. How do they inform this space? Yes, I acknowledge the fact that there is this relationship where we have outside universities feeding the policy space in the Pacific, but it's about time now that we also expand that to allow our national universities to inform these policy spaces, especially security. And part of this project is trying to provide that link, that it's an easy flow, not just having to seek and create and allow them to put in tenders, but actually be the ones that take control of this space. What also comes through from the discussion so far is the need to link community and traditional security knowledge systems to inform the work of the policymakers. This is a fundamental missing link which climate change is trying to address, but seriously, security is not. They have definitely not taken that on board. And so there's that opportunity for that space. And of course, acknowledging the existing work that has been carried out within these areas. There's so much great work out there in terms of climate change, work within the communities. We've heard it in the last panel, but they have not been elevated to inform these pieces. And of course, comes through from a lot of discussions is empowering not only these actors, but creating a systems that fit to inform these spaces. And I'll leave it there.
Thanks very much, George. A really comprehensive and useful sort of framing of what is an immensely complex but critical sort of area. And I think, you know, in really sort of talking about it very much in terms of its multi-scalarity, that it really is very provocative in terms of the kind of research that needs to be done there. So we're going to move on to our final panelist for this session, who's Dr. Judy Swann. Judy is the head of Military Health Services Pacific at International SOS Canberra, which is a major health and security services firm. And her role sort of includes managing relations with defence, paramilitary, maritime and peacekeeping sectors across the Pacific. Judy also has a background in government in Australia, in defence in particular, as well as having worked extensively across the NGO sector. She's going to be drawing on her recently completed PhD, I think at UNSW, which was on leadership development in the police and military forces of the South Pacific. And she's going to present some findings from the research, which entailed extensive interviews with over 170 people, I gather, from 35 nations to assess the current provisioning of leadership development support to the Pacific Island security forces. So Judy, over to you.
Thank you, Sinclair. Thank you, everyone, for giving me time to speak today. I think it's been a really interesting sessions today and yesterday. Excuse me. It's been a fantastic opportunity to be a part of this, a really important body of work and really important area to discuss amongst the Pacific Islands and all of the region. So thank you very much for that. As Sinclair mentioned, I did a PhD, a doctorate on leadership development for the police and military forces of the South Pacific. Excuse me, I'm just trying to find my papers here. I started the doctorate while I was working with the Department of Defence, and in that role I was with the department in the International Policy Division. I was the Director of Pacific Islands and Maritime Security. During that time I was awarded the Secretary for Defence's Fellowship to continue my research, so I was able to finish the doctorate under that program. So the recommendations that I've made following the doctorate have been given directly to areas of government, hopefully to impact some change. So the research that I provided, as Sinclair mentioned, was largely through interviews. There is very little research in this area, which struck me as astounding and disappointing, really. There's a lot of conversation, and we are here today to discuss the importance of the Pacific region in the geopolitical context and the relevance of the region to power shifts across the globe. And there is a lot of information about leadership development and how important it is to enterprises and to good governance, and as Henry spoke earlier about implementing things like the Boy Declaration. But there is very little research combining the two, the importance of developing Pacific leaders in the region. So I considered the current leadership development support programs that are provided to the police and military forces across the Pacific. I did as much research on literature as I could, but again there is very little actual literature available in this specific area. And I conducted 170 interviews across 35 nations. The majority of those interviews were within the police and military. I interviewed chiefs of police, chiefs of military and chiefs of police, bureaucrats, officials, non-government organisations, community leaders, women, youth, church leaders. I really wanted to cover as many views of leadership development as I possibly could, as well as the program deliverers and practitioners. I excluded Papua New Guinea from the scope because it just literally is so incomparable in terms of size and focus. And I also excluded gender leadership and the issue of female leadership development, again because it deserves its own body of research, and there is enough research available in that area if to follow through with that. What I also was surprised to find was the overwhelmingly common findings across all of those different stakeholder groups in terms of the leadership development requirements and the leadership development issues that are facing the Pacific. Again, the research gap was sort of astounding to me that it hadn't been picked up previously, and it's a body of work for future researchers to expand on. There's a lot of research out there in this particular area, but there is so much more that can be done. The Pacific is at a revitalised political juncture, as Dame Meg Taylor said in 2018. There are societal and existential threats on the Pacific Islanders and their leaders which are unprecedented. There's a duality to the role of Pacific leaders. It was said quite frankly to me that we wear two robes. They are village leaders, community leaders, family leaders, as well as chief and police and military, and they have their official roles as well as their community roles. So there's a substantial ripple effect that can be achieved through good development of leadership across the Pacific military and police sector in particular. The leadership is a focus area of a lot of current research, but again, the research can be expanded on substantially. The quality of leaders and development of emerging leaders makes an enormous difference to enterprise success and the ability of countries and organisations to implement good governance and understand the complex arrangements that are happening across the Pacific at the moment. Again, my research methodology was largely through participatory research. Those methods have been shown since the 1940s to be particularly useful in Indigenous communities and in communities where relationships matter, and as Henry mentioned earlier, relationships are significant across the Pacific, and so doing research in a way that respects and builds on those relationships was really important to me and to the participants. I've got a bit of a breakdown there of some of the literature that was really, really useful, and then the breakdown of the sort of people and the areas of the community that I access through interview. So, as I said, the research findings were amazingly common and held by many people. There are an enormous number of leadership programs happening in the region. Just as an example, I can tell you that there were, in the time that I was researching, over the 2 or 3 years that I was researching, there were programs being delivered by the Australian Federal Police, the Australian Defence Force, the New Zealand Police, the New Zealand Defence Force, the United States, plethora of departments, the Department of State, Army, Marines, Navy, Coast Guard, the FBI, the Australian Border Force, Australian and New Zealand Fisheries Departments, the Institute of Leadership Development. This doesn't include all of the exercises and operations that occur across the Pacific, and areas like the Nevada National Guard, the Wisconsin National Guard, even Netball Australia were offering leadership courses to police and military leaders during the time that I was researching this. So in effect, there was $100 million. The Australian government spends $100 million a year on leadership development and strategic awareness of police and military leaders only. So it's $100 million a year over the next 5 years, per year for the next 5 years. And it's surprising to say that that's not co-designed with the participants as closely as it could be. It's not contextualised at the very specific needs of the specific country that they're delivering that leadership in. And it's not very well evaluated. There are very little evaluative reports or information available on the leadership courses that are provided. Again, that $100 million doesn't include the military operations and exercises that occur, Exercise Talisman Sabre, RIMPAC, Exercise Quite Sud, some of these large exercises that happen across the region to develop police and military leadership. That $100 million doesn't include any of that. Again, limited evidence of needs-based development at all, and limited evaluation of the intent, outcome and long-term goals and the impact in country of the leadership development. Importantly also, I found that the courses and leadership development were culturally aware, and there's a lot of work being done by a lot of really great organisations on the development of culturally aware education. But some of the courses that were developed are not very culturally intelligent, and some of the delivery models were not very culturally intelligent. And the difference between those, as you probably know, cultural awareness tends to be a little bit a light version of cultural intelligence. Understanding people's cultures and respecting them tends to fall under the definition of cultural awareness. Cultural intelligence, or CQ as it's called, is now a measurable skill, and can be taught, can be measured, and can be re-measured again after teaching. And it includes better and deeper understanding of cultural motivators, influences, drivers, political systems, religious systems, community arrangements. So again, those leadership development courses were not developed in a really deeply and sound, culturally intelligent manner. During my research, I was able to do a candid leadership needs analysis of what is needed. Again, all of the research participants were very comfortable providing what they think their countries need and what their leaders need in the police and military forces. These are the sort of aggregated views of many. A lot more work can be done in this area. There's a need for real and respectful co-design and co-creation of leadership courses and development. As Henry and George mentioned earlier, the sovereign countries require sovereign and independent and discrete approaches to leadership development. Within a country like Vanuatu, there are 84 islands. It's completely different to the requirements of Tonga or Fiji or Palau or Kiribati. What the police need in those countries are very different to what the military might need in Tonga or Fiji or PNG, for example. And what one police leader needs in this year, in this context, is different to what someone will need in 5 years in that context. The timing and delivery of training and opportunities is an area that really needs a lot of focus. In the time that I was researching, as I mentioned, there was a plethora of leadership development opportunities going on, and a lot of them were crossing over without people knowing. There was one US defence advisor who told me that he was in one room and he could hear his own accent, an American accent, coming from another room, and he went in next door and it was the FBI doing a leadership course. And as a defence advisor in that country, he had no idea that they were even entering the country, let alone offering a leadership course. There was one Pacific Island National Disaster Minister who was crossing the tarmac to get onto a plane and walked past a lot of Australian and New Zealand Defence soldiers coming off that plane, and that was the first he realised there was an HADR exercise happening in his country. So the coordination is definitely not as good as it could be. English proficiency and training in local dialects was something that came up. English proficiency requirements for universities through the IELTS, International English Language Testing System, is around 6 to 6.5. Pacific Islanders, anecdotally through the Department of Defence, are coming in with leadership courses with language IELTS levels of around 5.8 to 7.1. So some work can be done on English language, but also importantly and respectfully, leadership courses in local dialects, particularly of the really complex issues that might be easier to understand in local dialects. Again, the cultural intelligence and understanding of cultural learning styles is really important. There are many academic organisations that are looking into this, and there's a lot of learning and research available into cultural learning styles. They're not being applied probably as well as they could be in leadership development opportunities across the region. Equitable and sustained access. This came up several times. Countries will be very focused on the Pacific for some years and then maybe not be as strategically focused over the next sort of part of a few years. And you do tend to get in some militaries in the Pacific Islands the same emerging leaders going to course after course after course, rather than maybe a more equitable approach that could be worked on with the countries. And then leadership skills for the increasingly complex needs of the country, whether that's humanitarian assistance and disaster response, climate change issues, contract negotiations, the complex infrastructure work that's being done across the Pacific. There's different requirements at different times in different countries, so the complexities of the region really need to be factored into the leadership development going forward. I mentioned cultural intelligence. You probably know in the areas that you work in, but there are 10 factors of cultural intelligence that are measured to assess the cultural, the CQ factor of a country. There's some great research sites which show the cultural factor measures for many nations. There's not very many for the Pacific, which is really disappointing. And some of these factors like power distance preferences. For example, Australia, if we saw the Prime Minister walking along the street, would probably yell out, hello Albo or something. In other countries, if you saw the President or the Prime Minister of your leader, your country, you'd be a lot more respectful. So that's a power distance measure that's measured in a lot of the countries that come up in the research. But again, not very much is done in the Pacific Islands. And those 10 factors could be and should be measured for every single country across the Pacific. Finally, I made some recommendations to the policymakers, as I mentioned, and because of the nature of my research, I was able to deliver this to some of the departments fairly quickly, which was really good, but again, useful for anyone working in this field. There's a real need to enhance the co-design and coordination and the collaboration for leadership development pertinent to each country and each country's requirements. Conducting needs analysis by country, improving the evaluation and monitoring of the current leadership and future leadership goals and methodologies. Identifying areas of unmet need. For example, there is very little done in the area of youth leadership training across the Pacific region. In some areas that's a real focus, in other countries very lacking. And there's also a concept of threshold concepts, which is an idea once known you can never unknow. So there's space in current leadership development to inculcate threshold concepts into the design. So just accepting that Pacific leaders face unique challenges, accepting that there is a duality to the roles that is unmatched in other areas, accepting that Christianity plays a big part in leadership in the Pacific, with 97% levels of Christianity, and that accepting that the cultural intelligence factor of each country and factoring that into leadership development is vital for future leadership development. That brings me to the end of my very short presentation on a very long thesis. It's available if you want to read it. Very happy to take questions now or later on. Thank you very much.